like to call the meeting to order. This is the June 8th, 2021 Rainbow District School Board Special Board Meeting, Budget. Please be advised that this meeting is being live streamed. The Rainbow District School Board would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, including Atikamekw, Anishinaabe, and Wahnapitae nations. We would like to acknowledge that we are situated within the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 and want to recognize the inherent rights of the Anishinaabe that maintain these lands from time immemorial. I'd like to take a moment now and call on Trustee Linda Dubosky.
Thank you, Doreen. I have the honor of sharing some words that have been prepared for tonight. Many people have had an opportunity to help with what I'm about to share. The last week and a half, of course, has been very somber. With the finding of the 215 First Nation children buried in unmarked graves in British Columbia. And so I'm grateful for the support of to all staff, to all people who share in the grief and sorrow of this horrific discovery. And so I'll begin. Flags are flying at half-mast at Rainbow schools and facilities in memory and in honor of the 215 First Nations children buried in unmarked graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia. First Nation leaders, residential school survivors, and their families have stated for many, many years that mass graves exist. This devastating discovery has now confirmed their statements and has now provided the long-awaited proof. We must not only acknowledge, but we must atone for this darkest chapter in Canadian history. Residential schools were established with one purpose in mind: not to educate, not to protect, not to preserve, but to intentionally and systemically assimilate Indigenous children and adolescents into European culture. A quote we all have heard that makes this statement true: to take the Indian out of the child. And to remove and isolate Indian children from their influence of their home, their families, their traditions, languages, and culture, all based on racist assumptions that First Nations cultures and people were inferior. Children and adolescents were brazenly and forcibly removed from their homes, ripped from the arms of their loving families, and taken to residential schools far away from what they knew as home, from what they knew as safe. The children were not allowed to be raised by their mothers and fathers with their siblings and loving support from grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, elders, or their community. Imagine you not being allowed to raise your children, not being able to share important milestones, not being able to celebrate birthdays, not being able to welcome your future grandchildren or celebrate any of their milestones, birthdays and graduations, for example. They were not allowed to speak their language, practice their culture, dress in their own clothes, or wear their hair as they chose. They were not allowed to be who they were. They were deliberately and recklessly robbed of the joys of childhood and adolescence and their right to grow up with family, to play, to learn, and to practice their teachings and their traditions and their language. They were robbed of their way of life enjoyed for generations by their ancestors. Worse yet, children suffered abuse at the hands of the adults who were responsible for caring for them, for protecting them, for keeping them safe. They were physically and sexually assaulted. They were malnourished and neglected. They died of disease. They died of broken hearts. They died alone. They were murdered. And now that these children were, and now we know that these children were in fact discarded in mass graves, nameless, never to be returned to their families and their communities for proper ceremonies or respectful burials. The indignities to their fragile and helpless little bodies cannot be ignored. And the cycle repeats itself for generations and generations. More than 150,000 Indigenous children were placed in residential schools between 1863 and 1998, a period of over 135 years. This is not the distant past. This was happening less than 25 years ago. More than 4,100 deaths in schools have been documented by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Missing Children's Project. But the total number we know is more, many more, possibly as high as 20,000, according to former Truth and Reconciliation Commission Chair Leader Marie Sinclair. This does not include the babies born at residential school who were cremated shortly after birth or drowned in nearby lakes. No parent sends their child to school to die. But then again, First Nations parents did not send their children anywhere. First Nation parents and families had no choice in this matter. They were forced. And residential schools were not schools. They were institutions that committed what has since been described as an act of cultural genocide and crimes against humanity. The intergenerational trauma created by these institutions continues to this day. It is manifested in high rates of suicide, incarceration, foster care, homelessness, and these are only to name a few. It is reflected as well in lower graduation rates amongst First Nation students. It is the sad outcome of what our government leaders and policymakers of the day chose to do to First Nations people in this country over and over and over again. We must build our knowledge of what happened then in order to build our understanding of what is happening now. We cannot ignore or cover up the truth found again and again, all rooted in the darkest chapter of Canadian history. Most importantly, we must reaffirm and recommit to being part of the solution. This shared history affects all of us. Our teachers and administrators must be mindful of how this latest discovery has impacted First Nation students, communities, families, elders, and in fact, every one of us. With guidance from First Nations people, communities, and elders, our board, our staff, our educators, and our allies must continue to be intentional with our work surrounding the truth and reconciliation. As we join together to seek understanding, acknowledging the truth, and recommitting and reaffirming to meaningful reconciliation. Let us join together with our First Nation communities, families, locally, and across the country. We remember and honor the missing children. We apologize for the atrocities suffered. We recommit and reaffirm to uncovering the truth so we can build toward meaningful reconciliation and the proper truth to be told and maintained so all of the lives lost will always be honored and never forgotten. I ask you now to join me in a moment of silence.
Thank you, Linda. Miigwech. The flags of the Rainbow Board will continue to fly at half-mast for the remainder of the week. I'd like to call on Director Blazik now for the roll call.
Trustee Dubosky,
Present.
Trustee St. Jean,
Present.
Trustee Gibson,
Present.
Trustee Cosmerly,
Present.
Trustee Morrison,
Present.
Trustee Dewar,
Present.
Trustee Hunda,
Present.
Trustee Stringer,
Present.
Trustee Clement,
Present.
Student Trustee Ava LaFrance,
Present.
all accounted for.
Motion that the agenda for the special board meeting budget of June 8th, 2021 be approved. Moved by Trustee Morrison, seconded by Trustee Hunda. Poll vote, Director Blazik.
Trustee Clement,
In favor?
Trustee Dubosky,
In favor.
Trustee Dewar,
In favor.
Trustee Gibson,
In favor.
Trustee Hunda,
In favor.
Trustee Cosmerly,
In favor.
Trustee Morrison,
In favor.
Trustee St. Jean,
In favor.
Trustee Stringer,
In favor.
Student Trustee LaFrance.
In favor.
Carried.
The motion is carried. Preliminary declarations of pecuniary interest. 2021-2022 budget presentation. I'll call on Superintendent of Business, Dennis Bazinet.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am pleased to present the 2021-2022 budget for the fiscal year beginning September 1st of 2021 and ending August 31st of 2022. As you will see, we've followed the same format as you have seen in previous years. On the title page, we clearly indicate it is a draft budget at this point in time. We have listed two key dates, which is tonight's meeting, June 8th, and the board meeting of June 29th, 2021, at which time we will be bringing forth the recommendation for approval. I am also pleased this evening to announce to trustees that this budget does meet the Ministry of Education compliance standards as a balanced budget. On page 2, we begin our presentation by listing the vision for education in Ontario. There are 4 pillars: the achieving excellence, ensuring equity, promoting well-being, and enhancing public confidence. On page 3, we list our board mission, vision, and values. Our mission statement: we bring learning to life, enabling students to fulfill their aspirations. Our vision: we are leaders in learning, inspiring success for all students by reaching minds and touching hearts. And then, of course, we list our values. On page 4, we move to our strategic directions, and we list our 2 main pillars: reaching minds and touching hearts, and the supporting standards underneath those pillars. On page 5, we move to the limitations as set out by the Ministry of Education. Ministry of Education recognizes that school boards need flexibility to decide how best to allocate resources within their budgets. But at the same time, there are limitations. Provincial curriculum programs shall be delivered to students. Class size targets for both elementary and secondary classes are to be met. Funding provided for special education shall be used for that purpose, and any unspent funds must be placed in a special education reserve. Funding intended for new schools or additions, major capital work, must be used for those purposes, and also unspent funds must be placed in a capital reserve. The school board administration and governance spending shall not exceed the grant allocation. And finally, the funding under the Priorities and Partnership Fund, PPF, must be used as prescribed by the ministry. Additional limitations by the ministry on page 6 is that budgets must be balanced. The use of reserve funds or accumulated surplus to balance the budget is limited to the lesser of the board's accumulated surplus for the preceding year and 1% of the board's operating revenue. So for us, 1% of the board's operating revenue is just over $1.8 million. Ministry approval is required for the use of reserves that are in excess of these limits prior to final approval of the budget. Such is not our case this year. On page 7, we list the criteria for establishing next year's budget. At a minimum, we want to maintain current programs and services. We use the current year, 2020-2021 revised expenditure budget as our base, as adjusted to exclude any one-time budgets in the current fiscal year, and we must also include for the upcoming year the terms and conditions of employment, which in this case are for the period of 2019 to 2022, the collective agreements that were centrally negotiated as well as locally negotiated, adjustments for inflationary pressures, statutory increases, the impact of declining enrollment in the various panels, as well as the 2021-2022 special education budget, which was approved by the board on May 18th of 2021. On page 8, we list the enrollment, which is the average daily enrollment, ADE, of all students. We compare the revised estimates to the estimates projected for the upcoming fiscal year. So at the elementary panel, we see that we are projecting at this point in time a decline of 86 ADE students. At the secondary panel, predicting a slight increase of 69.5 ADE students. We're also predicting a decrease in the high credit and the adult day school for an overall decrease of 30 ADE students on a beginning student population of 13,150. Just want to comment at this time that, of course, when we talk of the estimates for the next fiscal year, we are projecting both the count dates of October 31st and of March 31st, 2022. On page 9, we list the facilities or buildings that are in operation, and there is no change from the current year. We have 31 elementary school buildings, 9 secondary schools, and 1 administrative building. Of course, as we move and we look to the future consolidation in the New Sudbury area, this page will certainly be changing as we move to the 2022-2023 fiscal year. At the bottom of the page, we list the various programs that are run by the board. And of course, very last statement is Bear Down College, which operates at Cambrian College. On page 10, we list the various components of the grants for student needs, the GSNs, and we've made a few updates, and we've provided the fiscal year in which those updates did occur. So under the Pupil Foundation grant, you'll notice that the last 2 lines, the one entitled additional educational software licensing did come into existence in the current fiscal year of 2020-2021. And there's a new student technological devices component in the Pupil Foundation grant that is being introduced for next fiscal year. I will be elaborating a little later on in the presentation. Under the School Foundation grant, there were two changes, and they're not new funding, but just a shifting of where it was located to where it is now located. So library staff did move into the School Foundation grant in the current fiscal year, and for next year, the parent engagement allocation will be moving from the governance grant to the School Foundation grant. Under the special purpose grants, the very last line is the supports for student fund, which was introduced in the current fiscal year, and it relates to additional funding that was part of the central agreements that were negotiated for all boards. So now I'd like to take a few moments and provide some additional information as it relates to adjustments that have occurred in the GSNs, or the grants for student needs, for the upcoming school year. So in terms of COVID-19 supports, the ministry has recognized that additional funding for technology devices for students and mental health supports will be ongoing, and is component is now being folded into the GSN. So for technology, as I just elaborated on the previous page, there is a new component under the Pupil Foundation grant, as well as a top-up component as applicable under the Geographic Circumstances grant. Under this new funding, a new allocation of $7.11 for each student, kindergarten to grade 12, is in the Pupil Foundation grant. And there is a top-up allocation that guarantees a minimum of $50,000 for each board. So in our case, our student enrollment is enough to exceed the $50,000. Under mental health supports, there's a new allocation that is being provided entitled Supporting Student Mental Health Allocation, and it is moving within the Mental Health and Wellbeing grant. The ministry also will be providing additional PPF funding for mental health and special education, and that will be outlined as we move through the presentation. The ministry is also introducing what they're entitling a recent immigration supplement, and it's due to the extraordinary and temporary decline in recent immigration. It is considered a time-limited funding, and it will appear under the language grant as we move to the revenue page. It is expected that it may only be for the current or the upcoming fiscal year, and at this point, no guarantees that it will continue beyond that. In terms of compensation, the ministry will adjust the salary benchmarks by 1% for all employees of the board, excluding directors of education, superintendents, and principals or vice principals. The principals and vice principals are currently negotiating at the central table, and therefore it is expected that information will be coming to us in the upcoming fiscal year. Ministry is also providing some adjustments to the benefit plan, which involves the trust funds, and that is outlined on the revenue page as well. In terms of online learning, just want to take a moment because this will have, at this point in time, an ongoing impact on board funding, not only next year, but in future years. What the ministry has decided to do is to update the funding methodology for online courses by adjusting the benchmark funding through the secondary Pupil Foundation allocation, which is part of the Pupil Foundation grant. And essentially what they are doing is the following: is because the class size for online learning is considered 30-to-1, and the class size for in-person learning is funded at 23-to-1, the ministry is making an assumption for next year that 8% of our secondary students will be taking at a minimum one online course. As such, they are automatically adjusting the funding based on their estimate. Also, the ministry has indicated that in the upcoming years, that percentage is projected to increase. At this time, it is unclear whether or not there will be an opportunity for the boards to actually submit what is actually happening at its schools, so that if there is a significant difference between what the board or what the ministry is estimating and what the board is experiencing, because there is an opt-out provision built in at this time, it's unclear whether or not we'll have that opportunity. It may be an opportunity at revised, or it may only be an opportunity at year end, or it may not be an opportunity at all. So this is of significant concern to us, as essentially it is a reduction in overall funding for managing our secondary schools. In terms of the targeted new investments, as previously mentioned, the Supports for Student Fund, which was additional funding as a result of the central agreements for the period 2019 to 2022, will continue, and it is outlined on our revenue page, and for our board, essentially it's just over $1.6 million. Under school operations allocation, the ministry will provide a 2% cost adjustment to the benchmark for the non-staff component of the school operations allocation to assist school boards in managing the increases in its utilities and other costs. In the area of transportation, at the top of page 13, at this time, the student transportation grant will be maintained at the current level with adjustments for any enrollment growth. At this time, we're not projecting enrollment growth, therefore, essentially our funding is status quo. Unfortunately, this will be a cost pressure area as our student transportation expenses are predicted to increase next year. In terms of some transfers into the GSNs, the Specialist High Skills Major, acronym SHISM, there was a component within the GSN and there was a component under a PPF. They are now moving the PPF component into the GSN, and this allocation will be transferred and consolidated within the existing SHSM allocation, which is part of the Learning Opportunities Grant. There's currently a PPF entitled After School Skills Development Programs, and essentially it will move from PPF status into the GSN, and it is additional funding to provide students with autism certain opportunities that are outside of the instructional day. The allocation will be part of the special education grant. The Integrated Services for Northern Children, ISNC. This funding is being moved into the GSN. However, it is being funded through a regional basis, and the funding will flow to the lead boards. So for Northern region, the lead board is DSB1 Timmins. Therefore, Timmins will receive the funding directly from the Ministry of Education, and then we need to negotiate the allocation for the balance of the boards within the region. So at this time, that component of negotiations or discussion is not finalized. On page 14, the additional education software licensing was a component of the current year. It remains a component under the Pupil Foundation grant. It is being increased to 84 cents per ADE. There's missing the per ADE, my apologies. With a minimum allocation of $50,000 through a top-up allocation for all boards. In terms of other ongoing implementation, the retirement gratuities. Next year is the 10th year of a 12-year phase-out of the retirement gratuities. And under the current allocation and the phase-outs, there is an annual reduction in the benefit component of the benchmark, and that will continue for the balance of year 11 and year 12. Under capital, school condition improvement, school renewal allocations continue into next year. However, the overall amount at the provincial level has been reduced, and you will see on the revenue page that our SCI allocation has also been reduced for next year. On page 15, we list the priorities and partnership fund. This is funding that is outside of the GSNs, and what is listed on page 15 is the announcements to date. The ministry does have other allocations that will be announced throughout the upcoming fiscal year. So as you can see, listed on this page are the various titles, and the total amount is $1.2 million, of which the largest amount continues to be the mathematics strategy, which is $586,000. There's also a significant component under the specialist high skills major expansion programs as it relates to new programs which are being implemented by the Rainbow Board for the upcoming fiscal year, and that represents $347,000. On page 16, the ministry has also announced at this time some PPF funding entitled COVID-19 supports. As you can see under the various headings on the left-hand side of the page, it is to assist in covering expenses in the various areas, and the directive at this point in time is that boards are only to use 50% of the allocation we are in. We're projecting that we would withdraw just over $1.3 million from our reserve, which would give us an ending balance in August of $6.9 million in the accumulated surplus reserve. Essentially, that becomes our beginning balance as we look to the next fiscal year. So from that balance of $6.9 million, we are projecting a further draw of $1.6 million in the next fiscal year, which would leave us with an estimated closing balance on August 31st of 2022 of just under $5.3 million. So I just wanted to take that moment to show trustees where these amounts are coming from as it relates to the accumulated surplus reserve. So on page 19, we now move to the expense side of what's projected for next year. And on page 19, we're showing the expenses by what is termed object or object codes. So once again, we see that our salaries and our benefits, respectively, $137.5 million and $24.1 million, combined represent approximately 75% of our overall budget of $215.4 million. And then we have the various other subcategories: supplies, services, capital, fees, contracts, association fees, and then education program other, which is now our PPFs, bringing in that funding of $3.3 million. On the following page, page 20, once again, it's the expenses, however, just categorized by what is termed by the ministry as function codes or various areas. So the main area, of course, is considered instruction. So it represents $127.5 million, followed by school management and student supports and so on. So once again, pupil accommodation, the $36 million represents not only the operating portion, but also from the revenue page, the capital components as well. So the final page of our report is page 21, and it just lists the various dates which are imposed on the school boards by the ministry on the various reporting dates and cycles. So the estimates, which is the current budget that we're speaking of, is due to the ministry EFIS submission by June 30th, 2021. And of course, then we moved into November, which is financial statements for the current year we're in, 2020-2021 fiscal year. And then come December, we're into revised estimates for next year, and then May of next year is the financial reporting at March 31st. So that, Madam Chair, does conclude the presentation, and would be pleased to respond to any questions trustees may have.
I see several hands up. I see Trustee Morrison, Trustee Cosmerly, Trustee Clement. So Trustee Morrison, would you like to start off, please?
Sure. I'll start off. Excuse me, Madam Chair. Just wondering, Dennis, as you go over that overview at the top level, I'm seeing a couple of things that are I'm struggling with the words to describe it. Not areas of risk, but areas of concern, areas we need to watch out for. And two that I'm seeing in particular are that secondary class size stuff in relation to online learning and what that does to our funding. And the second one that I'm really quite concerned about is new registrations, the early learning year 1, year 2, of which we already know that the enrollment this year was I think 90% down from what was forecasted, and that was understandable based on the COVID situation, that parents, instead of starting their kids off in school for the first year, held them at home. I guess I'm wondering, because so much of our funding is enrollment based, how have we forecasted next year's early learning enrollment? Are we forecasting a double year enrollment? Are we expecting some student loss? And it's really critical, not only obviously for next year's funding and stability, but for the next 13, 14 years of educational funding. So just wondering how we handle the enrollment predictions for early learning year 1 and year 2 next year. And am I right, Dennis, that those would be the two things that we need to keep our eye on? I'm hoping I'm wrong. Thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. Essentially, at this point in time, whenever we're forecasting the upcoming fiscal year, as previously stated, yes, we are forecasting the 2 count dates, essentially. And we're certainly working with the estimates that have been provided from the various schools. And the volatility when it comes to enrollment risk in terms of predictions is very high at this point in time, without a doubt. It certainly has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 impacts of prior year and current year, and most certainly will have perhaps a lesser impact as we move forward. Having stated that, I guess I would like to also perhaps present a degree of optimism, saying that as we look to the activities on the public health side of what is happening in terms of the measures being taken and the vaccine programs that is slowly migrating, if you wish, into the area of our younger children, that could present certain positive impacts maybe as soon as the next fiscal year. At this point in time, it is working with the best information we have. There's no doubt that the projections are much lower than they have been in the past. That's been our reality in the current year as well. We're hopeful that once we get a sense of what our plans are for September, because we still need to review certain components of how we will deliver our educational programs in September. It may give us another insight as to what are the parents of those younger children thinking, because as you have clearly stated, when it comes to year 1, or JK as we previously termed it, that is optional. Parents have that option. It's not mandatory age yet. So We're hopeful at this point, but we are a bit on the conservative side, which does reflect the loss of revenue as well. September, October will certainly bring that to light and therefore impact what happens at the revised budget as well.
Thank you very much. Trustee Cosmerly.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. I've got 3 questions, if that's okay. The first one is about the student transportation. You had said that there was no change from this year, but was there reduced student transportation this year because of everything that happened with COVID? And so the budget for 21-22, is that basically reflecting a reduced amount of student transportation anyway?
Just to make sure I'm following the question, is the adjustment that did occur in the current fiscal year was actually an adjustment, a bit of a clawback for the previous fiscal year when we first shut down in 2020. As we speak this evening, the ministry has not indicated any clawback to the current fiscal year in terms of transportation with the shutdown, in terms of in-class or students learning in class. However, what we're predicting is 2 components for next year. So on the funding side, the ministry has said the formula is not changing, and essentially you should be receiving what you're receiving this year. Those were statements. However, we have to adjust on the expense side because should transportation resume as normal in September, which we are hopeful it will, as we see all students come back to in-person learning in our schools, we will incur those costs 100%. So that's why, once again, once we see our enrollment in September, October, and once we get into that period of adjustments at revised, we would have a better assessment of the real impact on both the funding side as well as the expense side. So
Thank you. That makes things a lot clearer. I don't envy you trying to organize or try to calculate a budget after the year that we've gone through with all of the changes. I had 2 other questions, if that's all right, Madam Chair.
Absolutely.
Okay, the second one was about the ISNIC funding. How much do we usually request? You were saying that that's DS1 that usually manages the pot for ISNIC funding. How much do you figure we usually require for ISNIC funding?
So just to clarify, the change that was outlined this evening takes effect next fiscal year. And I will defer the question to my colleague, Superintendent Washnook. Thank you.
Hello, through you, Madam Chair. Typically, our funding for ISNIC is $98,000, and we are responsible for the services to Huron-Superior, as well as Rainbow. We do give Sudbury Catholic some dollars for assessments for their students. It's minimal. The Algoma is also in that group of boards, but they've chosen to provide services in another way, and so they don't typically invoice for ISNIC dollars.
Thank you. And my last question is just about the government's decision to open up the option for online learning for students next year. Are we guesstimating how many students we may have doing pure online learning, and does that impact the way you've had to prepare your budget? And that's my last question.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. Essentially, What we have yet to do was actually survey our parents as to what their intent is for the upcoming school year. We will be looking at some form of survey in the month of June to get that assessment, as that it will have a direct impact on how we deliver the programming, both for in-person as well as remote. The component of COVID-19 supports that we have listed once again on page, where is it? Sorry, on page 16 of the report. When we look at primarily the component of additional staffing supports, that is the amount that we would be looking to assist us in providing the remote learning opportunities at the elementary level, similar to what we've done this year. So at this point in time, we have not, in our staffing, put in any permanent FTE as it relates to the remote learning component for elementary students.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Trustee Clement, and then Trustee Gibson. And then
Thank you,
Trustee
Madam Chair. Sort of asked and answered. I was going to ask that same question, online and in-person learning. But you did mention that you will, Dennis, that you are going to survey the people to find out who's going to go online. If that happens, a certain amount of people still are scared and they'll go online just in case. But if everything is opened up in September, the people who've signed up for online learning, is that where they're going to be for the first semester? Or can they then, if everything's open, can they just change their minds? I guess these are all assumptions, I guess. Thanks.
Madam Chair, we'll ask Superintendent Burgett.
Thank you for your question. When we survey, we will be asking people to make a commitment for a period of time, because the planning that will be in place will have to be effective for the first half of the year at the least, just so that we have some stability in our staffing and consistency of having the same educator in front of students for a period of time to properly educate them and form an assessment.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Trustee Gibson.
Thanks, Chair Dewar. Yeah, just if I could just clarify, I had the same question as Trustee Cosmerly and Trustee Clement. So, because I heard two things, so I'm not 100% sure. So I thought I heard that this budget's like a status quo, and so that would include the remote elementary school in these figures, but then I heard you say there was no FTE for the remote elementary school. So can you just clarify, do these numbers include staffing for the remote elementary school or not?
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. The FTE complement does not include any staffing for the remote virtual elementary school.
Thank you. And supplementary, if I may, the number of principals and vice principals hasn't changed. So the principal that's there is reallocated somewhere else. Is that what you're saying? There's nothing specifically allocated to REVs?
There is no current allocation to REVs as we speak this evening.
Okay,
that individual returns to their permanent position on paper.
Thank you for clarifying. That's very clear to me now. And my other question was around the educational software allocation, which I think you said was new this year. Obviously, I know we use a lot of software, so we've been purchasing and making these payments previously. Do you have like a ballpark figure of what we actually spend on software licensing? Because I think you said we'd be getting just over $50,000. I'm just curious how much that actually costs.
Through you, Madam Chair, essentially that allocation was introduced in the current fiscal year. It is being continued next year. It was a change that the ministry implemented because they used to, the ministry, provide all school boards with free access to certain softwares under OSAPAC, which was just another one of those acronyms. But they decided to discontinue. Therefore, they have provided, and pardon the expression, boards a meager token of appreciation that we now need to manage these on our own. And this is a far cry from what it currently costs us. I do not have an accurate figure, but I can assure you that it is well over that component of grant.
Thank you very much. I'd be really interested to hear if we could nail down some sort of figure maybe for the next meeting, because as you said, it doesn't come anywhere close to covering it, and it's not going to be something that goes away. It's only going to increase. So we might need to look at asking for some change there. And that was all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have Trustee Stringer, and then I see Trustee Morrison, but let me go to Trustee Stringer first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have 3 questions. For Superintendent Basnet, through you, Madam Chair. The first one is around the mathematics strategy. So in the PPFs, we have $586,000 that's been allocated for the mathematics strategy. I have had parents expressing concern about the loss of the impact of their children's reading and literacy skills this year. Is this a mandated, and I seem to recall you may have said something that we didn't have a choice about how much had to be spent in that area, and I don't see that sort of anything supporting in that way for literacy. Is that mandated by the province?
Through you, Madam Chair, it is listed under our PPFs on page 15. Therefore, it is a transfer payment agreement which dictates the terms under which the $586,000 will be spent. And this has been for the last several years as part of program, if you wish, and has not increased. So I'm not sure I've answered the question or not, but it is clearly identified as a PPF. Therefore, under the transfer payment agreement, it would outline what our expectation as well as eligible and ineligible expenses.
Thank you. Supplementary question, no, another question, please, is just around the school condition improvement funding. So it's decreased by $2 million. And I understand that, our buildings were coming along with our building improvements. And do you see this as a concern for us? It's a overall provincial allocation that's been reduced. Do you see this causing us a problem or a challenge ahead, or will we be fairly stable even with the $2 million reduction?
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. Of course, any reduction is always an area of concern. However, I have to put it in context that if we were to go back even 5 years, these amounts were very much lower, and they were then introduced, and in actual fact, I'm actually pleased that it remained at this high level. Because earlier this year, through COSBO, which is our Association of Business Officials, similar to CODE, there was discussion that Treasury was putting a lot of pressure on the government to reduce capital dollars because many boards were not spending their current allocations. We're not one of these boards. We had a very definitive plan. It was slightly delayed because of the delays in the implementation of our overall rebalancing of our asset of buildings. However, we've been spending a good amount of those dollars in renewing / upgrading all of our buildings that we know will be with us now for many years to come. So yes, it is. It was expected as a decrease. It is less than what I had originally anticipated. So overall, I'm feeling pleased. But again, once again, it's one of these things that you're hopeful that it won't evaporate over 1 year period either. So.
Thank you. And my last question, Madam Chair, for Superintendent Bazinet, is around the transfer of to GSNs of some of the PPFs. So if I'm looking at the page 16, priorities, no, not page 16. The PPFs that moved from, or the GSNs that moved into, sorry, the other way around, the priorities and partnership fund pieces that moved from GSNs into PPFs. I'm just confused about why the province, and I know you're not a mind reader, but do you understand what the intent of that was?
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. Essentially, the way the ministry has been operating is often they will issue PPFs, and then they will gauge the impact of those PPFs. And often we have seen over the years that if they've repeated the PPFs over several fiscal years, it often indicates a need that is ongoing. Therefore, they do take the opportunity on an annual basis to review those PPFs and then decide which ones they want to incorporate into the GSNs, which is always viewed from a school board perspective as a welcome initiative there, because it typically indicates stability into future years. Yes, they do decide, and I'm sure it's through some form of assessment in terms of all the reporting that is done by the various school boards for all the PPFs, and then decide at what point in time they want to incorporate it into the annual funding formula.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Trustee Morrison.
Thank you for coming back to me, Madam Chair. I did have several questions, but I only asked my first one, so I'm going to keep, these are very brief. But one, I just wanted to confirm, in terms of staffing at the board level, Dennis, was this based on 3 academic superintendents or 4?
This is based on the current complement of 3 academic superintendents and 1 business superintendent.
Thank you. So that would mean, so still leaving 1 position vacant is what this budget is based on?
As compared to past years, yes, you are correct.
Thank you. And my second question, Madam Chair, through you again, is related to a couple of things. I just wanted to confirm our major capital projects. So for example, the JK to 6 French Immersion School, the work that we're doing out in Chelmsford, the work that is about to start at Churchill, those projects will continue?
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. Yes, those projects are funded under separate capital grants. Therefore, they are not part of the annual SCI or renewal funding. So they are separate pockets of capital funding, and those projects will continue.
Thank you. That was the answer I expected, Dennis, but just wanted to get it on record. So thank you very much. And my third question is related to the ventilation projects. Will those projects, I know a lot of the work has been done this year, but there's still going to be some outstanding work to be done. Are those projects going to continue?
Yes, once again, much of the ventilation funding was essentially like a PPF, one-time funding that was announced earlier in the current fiscal year. So therefore, that funding remains available to boards, and there are essentially 2 deadlines that we're working to. One is current fiscal year, well, I should say 3, August 31st for certain projects, December 31st, 2021 for other projects, and up to end of 2022 for others if need be, all related to the joint provincial federal funding as it relates to some of those major ventilation projects. So that work will continue, and once again is outside the purview of what you've been presented this evening.
Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate that clarification. And I just want to say, as one trustee, I'm very glad when we see anything move from PPF to grants for student needs, because I too have interpreted that over the years as much greater stability, especially when there's changes in government. And PPFs tend to come and go much more readily. So that's just opinion of one trustee. Thank you. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you very much, trustees. I don't see any more hands up. So I'm going to say thank you very much to Superintendent Bazinet. And I will encourage people to go through the draft report again at your leisure. And if you do have any questions, I think it's quite acceptable to give our superintendent of business a call, and he's more than willing to do the best he can to answer all of our concerns. So please take advantage of that. New business, requests for leave of absence. There are none. But just before we adjourn tonight's meeting, Director Blazek, I wonder if you have any updates about this year's graduations.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was assuming you were going to ask. As you know, just a couple of things. I just want to remind folks that, and maybe I'll just give you a little bit of a chronology first so you know where we're coming from. As you know, last week, the Premier announced, it was last Wednesday, I guess, that remote learning for the balance of the school year would be in place, and it was a result of health and safety concerns. And he also announced that all grades would have a celebration or graduation at the end of the school year. Following that, the Minister of Education and the Deputy Minister, again last week, announced provisions for celebrations that would be created in order to provide or to lessen the restrictions or the requirements for those restrictions. The ministry indicated it would be willing to work with boards in that respect. We did receive a memo from the ministry that did provide some guidance. That came yesterday. And there's two things that I just wanted everybody to note, because it is not the same as what the Premier had indicated earlier last week. And I'll just read it to you. It says, the guidance outlines health and safety requirements as well as possible approaches boards could consider. School boards may have planned virtual graduation ceremonies which should proceed, augmented by outdoor end of school year celebrations where possible. So to that end, the ministry and the minister has acknowledged that virtual grads have been planned and have been set in order to occur for the end of this current school year. And typically that's only for grade 8 and for grade 12. At least that's been our practice going forward. To be clear, I just want everybody to remember that Ontario is currently still in a kind of a pre-stage 1 environment, which reflects the stay-at-home order. And that, if you're interested in seeing it, you can go to the roadmap to reopen Ontario, just Google it, and you'll see the entire document. And just so everybody is clear on this, we are moving to stage 1 on Friday of this week. That's June the 11th. And again, the requirement for that is 60% adults must be vaccinated, and also this the requirements that that public health will be looking at, and the Premier has been looking at, that everything remains status quo or is dropping over the next 21 days. Now, some of the requirements under the stage 1, outdoor gatherings are limited to 10 people, and you require 2 meters of physical distancing. And they've also added, in terms of accommodations for us, if they were to consider something, there would be no gowns and no access to the buildings. So those are very challenging. The second piece, though, you all are probably aware of this. Step 2, if it were to happen, would start July 2nd, because that's the 21 days from the June 11th. And again, we would have to have 70% of our adults would have their first dose and 20% would have their second dose in order to make sure that we meet that requirement. And there would be a maximum of 25 people outdoor for social events. Now, what the ministry has done, though, they've indicated that if you can keep 2 meters of distance, that you could have far more in attendance. That would be near impossible for our schools to establish. And our schools have not planned for that. So to date, I'm just reminding everyone that we have planned for virtual grads for quite a time. In fact, I think I recall back in February, I announced that we would be doing this. But so tonight, I am confirming that all secondary and elementary schools will hold virtual grads for grades 8 and 12 students for the 2020-2021 school year. And to date, I have received several inquiries about graduation, and I will be sending a letter to parents tomorrow confirming our plan. I want students and parents to know that schools have taken their hopes and their concerns and their questions seriously, and that staff will be augmenting grads in order that that night is indeed special. Our staff is working very hard at that. Schools and staff are being very creative. And I just, without belaboring this, we did a survey of our schools to see what they're doing in terms of that augmentation, because that was a key word in the minister's address. So I'm not going to name the school, but I'm going to just identify a few things that schools are doing to make it so that we can identify that grads will be special. For example, at one school, they're ordering student designs hoodies. They're using student design themed logos and grad names to create a class of 2021 banner to hang in the gym. And has ordered grad caps to distribute to graduates. And they were able to take photo company that won't respond to the request to come, and they'll take photos. However, unfortunately, they're not able to do that just yet. But the township has worked with them, and they're giving them some travel mugs, and they're willing to do other things as well within the limits of the provincial restrictions. Example, drive up or drop off of diplomas if possible. Another one, virtual slideshow of each student to be sent out on June 24th to the students' Gmail accounts. In addition, we're inviting students and their parents to come to the school on June 24th using a sign-up time to receive a gift, a celebration in a box, and their certificates. The gift will include everything the family needs to safely celebrate the virtual stepping up ceremony at home. And we have also rented a congrats sign from sign-up yards where students and parents can have their picture taken outside, following all physical distancing and health safety protocols. Just wanted to mention one of the high schools. One of the high schools, that they're offering a virtual grad, of course, and they will be emailing all the grad students, their and their families, the virtual grad on June the 28th. In addition, we'll be going to every door for all of our graduates to present them with a small gift. We have 4 buses booked on Monday, June 28th. All buses will be leaving at 1:30 p.m. and each bus going in a different direction. Approximately 4 to 5 staff members will be on each bus, and some other staff members may follow behind. Once at each house, we will get off the bus, present a gift, and provide an opportunity for parents and guardians to take a picture. So again, there's just many different ways, and I tell you, I have a list of probably about 30 schools here that have identified what they're going to do in order to make their grad night significant and memorable. And I just want to just remind folks that, again, as much as possible, we're trying to adhere to health and safety protocols. COVID is not over. The pandemic is not over. And to suggest that we would be able to manage large groups of students and parents in a field is an impossible task, and I would not put anybody at risk in doing that going forward. So a letter will be going home tomorrow. There will be a link. Again, and I appreciate the trustees that work on our behalf, and of course our principals and the hard work they're doing, and of course our students. And I know they are anticipating, and I know even as a result of Student Senate last night, that they were very engaged in identifying different ways that we could augment a graduation, a virtual graduation. So I'm very pleased that how our students are reacting to this. I know their hearts are broken. But this is for their safety, and I know that at some point in the future they'll be saying this was the right thing, and we will try and endeavor to do whatever we can to make this a very special evening. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Director Blazik. So I just want to point out to all of the trustees, excuse me, be sure to read the latest correspondence from the chair. It includes a special link that is entitled Guidance to End of School Year Celebrations. And in particular, it has a section that specifies all of the requirements. So in other words, there are definite requirements that have to be met. Enjoy. And now I'd like to suggest that we do now adjourn, moved by Trustee Morrison, seconded by Trustee Clement. Take care, be safe. Thank you so much, Trustee Dabowski, for that wonderful, those wonderful words. We so sincerely appreciate that. Good night, everyone.